Hey guys, welcome back. I want to talk about the role of women today, specifically women without children or women whose children have grown up and left home. I've spoken in a previous video about the passive heroism for women through the archetypes of either Aphrodite or Demeter. Both of these archetypes involve a woman defining herself in relation to another person, either her husband or her child. And these are noble roles, the two main heroic pathways for women, according to tradition. But not every woman has a husband or child to orient towards. Sometimes a woman may never find these things in life, whether by choice or by misfortune or error. But even for those who do find these, most women will eventually come to a point in their lives where they find themselves widowed or with an empty nest. Women will eventually come to this fork in the road where their identity needs to be redefined in some way because they've grown out of their previous role. And for women who never find that other person to orient their lives around, they also need to be able to figure out where they fit in. So the question is, what becomes of those women? What can they do to still live a meaningful and valuable life? So it is with that in mind that I would like to talk about the archetype of the crone. While it is not, strictly speaking, a heroic pathway in terms of being one that leads to the transcendent, it is still a critical role in any healthy community, one that can provide earthly fulfillment in women's lives, and one that merits understanding and respect. Unfortunately, in the modern age, older women have become invisible, and our societies are no longer structured around community in the way that it once was. We have become urbanized and atomized. This hurts us all, but is perhaps most disastrous for women past a certain stage in life, in a way that is not the case for men. And part of this is due to the changing nature of the female role over her lifetime and what she's valued for at each stage. So young women are valued for their beauty and fertility, and mothers are valued for their nurturing of the next generation. And then what? Invisibility and discardability sets in as the older women no longer have any compass to point them to where they need to go in the next stage of life, especially when many are not given an active role as a grandmother, which most would have been in the past, whether they have no grandchildren or they're not a big part of their grandchildren's lives for whatever reason. The triple archetype of the maiden mother crone is a holistic image that honors the female role at every stage of life. But in modern society, the crone is forgotten, the mother is often maligned, and the maiden has been reduced to an object of lust for her material beauty. And because the maiden is the only role that is still afforded anything resembling positive attention in society, this is why we see the modern phenomenon of older women who become loud and flamboyant or even obnoxious, who are in a floundering way trying to recapture the attention they garnered in their youth without having to have anything valuable to contribute. This comes from a lack of groundedness in their own being. They are still seeking to define themselves by their relationship to an other because they lack any other option. Removing the crone from society as an accepted expression of femininity has resulted in older women who are lost, depressed, or who behave in antisocial or subversive fashion. Part of the reason the crone is not honored anymore is due to the lack of honor for anything historical or traditional in favor of new and novel things, which is what the fresh-faced maiden archetype represents. We always want the spring, never the winter. So with that said, I would like to discuss what the crone is and what she represents, as well as how a woman can manifest her crone as she ages. If we consider the triple archetype of the maiden mother crone, we can see the development of women in this way. The work of the maiden is to discover what her gifts are and learn to use them correctly. The work of the mother is to nurture those gifts, either in the capacity as a mother to actual children as the Demeter archetype would do, or through some creative or spiritual process which is more suitable to Aphrodite. The work of the crone then is to tap into her insights which she has gained from a lifetime of working with her gifts and use those insights for the betterment of her community through speaking truth and sharing wisdom. At this stage of life, the crone is now freed from the demands of motherhood and is better placed to serve the wider community than a younger woman who has more demands in her personal life. The maiden spins the yarn, the mother measures it, and the crone cuts the thread of life. Evolving into a crone is a slow-moving process, one that can bring either great transformation or bitterness, and one can either embrace it with curiosity, dignity, and power, or with fear and resistance. Typically, we see the latter, as modern women are so afraid of losing their physical beauty, which they see as their only source of power in the world. And for young women, that is often true, as they have not yet developed the kind of wisdom and skills that can be a source of power for the crone. But so few women nowadays ever develop themselves beyond their own vanity, and thus rightly fear the aging process. If a woman has accumulated a certain amount of valuable life wisdom, then part of becoming a mature woman is realizing that you have value in and of yourself at all stages of life. But if a woman has failed to develop herself correctly, then she's right to fear what the aging process means for her. And I think it's hard for many women to come to grips with the idea that our bodies and our physical attractiveness will change continuously throughout life, whether we want them to or not, because we're so often valued purely for how we look, and in many cases, that is a value we attach to ourselves more than one put on us by the people in our lives. How often do we allow our self-esteem to be influenced by what we see in the mirror? But as women, as the physical embodiment of the feminine lunar principle, we represent becoming. We represent constant change, flux, and cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. Our bodies reflect our ontological character in that way, and this is nothing to fear or be ashamed of. The crone herself is a symbol of transformation. She is the feminine counterpart of the sage archetype for men, but the difference between the sage and the crone is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The sage has knowledge. He is educated and has studied all his life and become a master. The intellectual prowess of the sage comes from external objective knowing. But the wisdom of the crone is internal. It is insight and intuition, or even gnosis, what the Greeks call Sophia. The word crone comes from crown, indicating wisdom emanating from the head. Another word, which unfortunately now has a negative connotation, is hag, which comes from hagia, which means holy or spiritual. Our modern society places a lot of emphasis on logic, rationality, and empiricism, which are masculine ways of acquiring knowledge. Any kind of subjective or experiential wisdom is in the feminine domain and often brushed off as being of lesser quality knowledge because it cannot be weighed and measured by scientific standards. As such, women are not encouraged to develop their feminine wisdom, but to struggle against their nature by only trying to develop a masculine style of knowing, which is often at odds with their own intuition. Even the feminists have participated in this travesty of demeaning real femininity in their push to force women into STEM fields and their propaganda that there are no real differences between men and women in their attempt to force women to be more like men. It is essential to understand the difference between the masculine and feminine forms of knowing, because it is the delving into feminine wisdom that is foundational for the crone. This is not to say that we are limited to the type of knowing dictated by our biological sex. In fact, both sexes need to develop a capacity for both masculine knowledge and feminine wisdom in order to be fully developed individuals, and we access that opposite gender side of ourselves via our anima or animus when our relationship to our anima or animus is healthy and integrated. So, this is a Jungian concept that I won't get too much into here because it's a bit of a digression, but for those that don't know, the idea is basically that within each of us, we also contain the opposite gender. Your inner woman, your anima if you're a man, or your inner man, your animus if you're a woman. The quality of your relationship with your anima or animus is going to dictate how well you can master the opposite gendered form of knowing to a degree. And in fact, you could make the case that the healthiest and most developed forms of the anima and animus are equivalent to the archetypes of the crone and sage, where the final stage of the anima is actually called Sophia or wisdom, and the final stage of the animus is the incarnation of spiritual meaning. In other words, they both correspond to the old wise woman or man in their highest stage of development. Hello there. Nice to see you. Go play. Sorry about that. This Jungian concept is consistent with the world of tradition. And in Vedic teaching, for instance, the interplay of these internal masculine and feminine forces is it's part of the consolidation or unity of primordial energies. As it is said in the Upanishads, I have no need for an external woman, for I have found a woman within me. Just as a man can find Shakti or the divine feminine inside him, so too can the woman find Shiva, the divine masculine, within her. As a matter of fact, our attraction to the opposite sex is based upon this primary role being fulfilled, that of the unification of seemingly disparate energies into a complete person. Man is attracted to woman because she helps him learn how to feel more deeply, and woman is attracted to man because he helps her learn how to think with better clarity. In the case of well-developed couples, they age like a crone and a sage because they trust and admire each other, and with the right internal work, they can utilize the love between them. So a woman need not necessarily be single in order to develop this integrated animus and a unified state of being. Women today, especially in New Age communities, are preoccupied with the idea of being in touch with the divine feminine, their inner goddess, so to speak. But reveling in this aspect of their nature is much easier for women than to develop a healthier relationship with the masculine element. Older women need to develop their own inner Shiva force and become in touch with their divine masculine, which will provide the grounding center that only logic and rationality can add to her volatile energy and passions. The crone is very much a woman who has done this. She combines her powerful feeling capacity and intuitive instinct with her developed logic and a set of guiding principles to become a well-rounded and self-supported woman. Unfortunately, much of the modern literature on becoming a crone is more in line with this New Age thinking and with a fairly feminist bent that glorifies the feminine at the expense of the masculine. And women who follow this more New Age path to seek their crone will be left disappointed in the end, as they will not have the groundedness, self-sufficiency, and spiritual depth to face their journey. Although they may distract themselves from this truth with the warm, fuzzy feelings of a New Age ideology. So the crone represents the stage when we get to a point where we know enough from the outside and now want to go investigate and see what is inside and get to know our inner wisdom and intuition. Now, in doing this, there's often a process of transformation that can go on. Those who have done serious self-work on getting to know and integrating their inner shadow world in some fashion will know that this can often be a painful, heart-wrenching, and frightening process, and at times may be akin to a type of psychological death. And the crone's function is death. Not the physical death of the body, although that is the natural end result of our material bodies, but also transformative death of a metaphorical and metaphysical nature. She has a very Plutonian nature, the crone. This destructive aspect is not inherently sinister, although it has come to be seen in such a way in modern society which fears death of any kind. We've become attached to our material bodies for one, but the nature of our culture has also caused us to become so mired in ego that we cannot bear to give up any of our ego attachments in order to undergo necessary spiritual transformations. We can see this evident in all of the people who simply don't want to grow up, who resist the pull of time. In modernity, we have also come to see time as linear, and in that sense, death becomes a final end rather than an opportunity for rebirth, as it would be seen in the sense of cyclical time. So even something like a psychological death is seen through the eyes of fear and trepidation rather than an opportunity to be reborn anew. The crone has also historically been associated with crossroads, and we all come to crossroads in life or times of transition. The crone is meant to draw us inward during difficult times and bring meaning to our shadow side. The crossroads represents a place where consciousness and unconsciousness intersect, a place where you must surrender your ego to a higher will. The crone herself will have been at many crossroads in her lifetime, and in many cases may have been a frequent visitor of the metaphorical underworld. The result of these journeys is that she has reached a point where her ego demands are no longer relevant. She has no agenda, and she can be surrendered and detached, no longer kicking against circumstances. And so when we come to difficulties in our lives, if we are wise, we will look for the crone at our crossroads who can help guide us along the right path with some of the wisdom that she has learned along the way. The crone features in Joseph Campbell's monomyth cycle of the hero's journey as a protective figure that the hero meets on his journey and receives assistance from her in some way. When a woman has journeyed for a long time as a crone, she is in touch with her authentic self, the capital S self. She can face real truths. When we come to a place where we can face truths, surrender to a higher will, be present in the moment, and abandon our egos, then we will have nothing to lose. This is the positive side of the crone. So we have this archetypal figure who is associated with death and crossroads, two things that often generate some anxiety in most people, but which she feels quite at home with. And this is the reason she can be in touch with her authentic self. She has been at all the crossroads and made the difficult decisions. She has journeyed to her own personal underworld and seen her shadow side, and eventually she makes peace with these things and transmutes what would be fear and anxiety in a less developed person into inner strength, insight, and love. In order to do this, the crone will have also had to develop her masculine side through her animus, as I mentioned before, as this is where she will acquire the grounding principle within herself, needed to be stable enough for others to lean on, and to journey through the rest of life without a husband or son to orient herself towards in the way that Demeter and Aphrodite do. In fact, it is her earlier journey in life as either Demeter or Aphrodite in which she will often learn to cultivate this masculine side of herself. Both the sage and the crone, in fact, come to their power because they have integrated their opposite gender qualities within themselves and created an alchemical marriage within themselves, which is why both of these archetypes are considered wise and spiritual despite whatever their gender orientation is. When the anima and animus archetypes, the divine feminine and the divine masculine, are integrated into one, they function as a healthy tension between the two. Denying or suppressing the masculine or feminine side of ourselves creates an imbalance in the psyche, so it's necessary to reclaim the missing side to restore harmony, especially if you wish to become a crone or a sage. So having mentioned Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey actually leads me to an interesting point, and that is that the hero's journey might not be the most appropriate metaphor for women, especially older women. It is a very relevant metaphor for men as they find their heroic pathway, whether as an ascetic or as a warrior, but you could argue that women are a little different. Campbell's hero's journey is all about separating from society and journeying alone for a while in order to become individuated and eventually return home as a more spiritually whole person. It's a very action-oriented path. I do think there are certainly some women who would resonate with that pathway, depending on their individual nature and perhaps what stage of life they're at, but on the whole, this hero's journey is much more suited to the masculine nature, whereas women are communal and relational, and our spiritual journey can often involve coming together with others or going inward or below ground to find transformation rather than the above ground journey of the male hero. So when we consider the traditional paths to heroism for women via the Aphrodite and Demeter archetypes, we see that it is not the same as the active heroism of men, but a passive heroism that is service-oriented and relational. She is the wind beneath the wings of others, which is a no less important role, although Hollywood and modern feminists would have us women believe that if we're not the main character of the story, then we're being somehow oppressed, despite the fact that the supporting characters are just as important to the story and often just as interesting. When we look to the myths and stories about crones, we often find them undertaking tasks that involve slow, laborious transformations, such as brewing some kind of potion over many days made from herbs that may have taken months to gather, or collecting and preserving things in danger of being lost, and in many cases collecting things that are rather macabre, like bones, which represents their connection to death. In fact, the feminine journey can often look like she's doing nothing. But rather than being a call to adventure, such as Campbell's hero, we see more of a call to surrender. She is patient, and she endures, going about her work quietly. And in this respect, it can be beneficial to be one of these invisible older women, as one can accomplish quite a lot when one is invisible. Her tasks require commitment and endurance. The fruits of her efforts are not always readily apparent and may not appear until quite some time has passed. But this call to surrender is quiet and often goes unheard among the noisy shouts of the call to adventure. And so many women never hear it, and then they reach their old age unsure of what to do with themselves or how to spend their time, yearning for the days of their youth in which people paid attention to them. But this is the pathway to activating the crone archetype within ourselves, and in truth, a woman can begin work on this path before she is physically old. There is no age limit on it. The reality is just that most women do not have that kind of time for themselves until they are older. Unfortunately, we see very few crones these days. Most women fail to develop themselves in any deep way during their lives. They rely too long on being able to have beauty without substance that when they finally lose their beauty, as we all eventually will, they have nothing else left to offer. They have no wisdom, no insights, no skills. They become old people who sit around waiting to die, or who distract themselves from existential angst by going on endless retiree cruises or watching television with nothing to talk about except their health problems. Their children don't visit them, and their community doesn't care about them. Many people will tell women that a good reason to have children is to have someone to take care of them in their old age. But what this kind of advice critically leaves out is that fact that if you are a boring person with no wisdom or guidance for your children and grandchildren, they will not want to visit you. And if they do, they will not stay any longer than they absolutely have to. You will still face a lonely existence in old age. So strive to be the kind of person who will be mourned by your entire community when you pass, and the kind of person that younger people love to hear stories from. So now that we have some understanding of what the crone is and a rough roadmap of how to get there, let's refine this just a little. It is not simply enough to take on the outer trappings of cronehood. The inner journey must be genuine to reap the fruits of it. So first, we must honor our authentic selves. This is who you are, not who others want you to be, but it is also not your ego self. It is the capital S self, your true nature, your inner divinity, your soul. It is who you are once you strip away all material labels that describe yourself or your roles. You are not your relationships to other people. You are not your hair color or the shape of your body. You are not your talents or your knowledge. You are not your cravings or aversions. Find out who you truly are underneath all of that other stuff. If you can't take it with you after you die, then it's part of your ego self. Second, embrace the sacred feminine. It is sometimes hard to do this in the hyper-masculine world that we live in, where even so-called feminists poorly mimic masculinity. But when you get in touch with your true feminine wisdom, you can become a wise woman and a healer of sorts to your community. This means developing the relational and feeling side of yourself, which some modern women struggle to do in a way that is healthy, such as in the fashion of the New Age community. Third, undertake your own transformation. Explore your shadow side to gain enlightenment and find creativity and insight. Tap into the archetype of the crone in the collective unconscious and use it as a guiding light. Become attuned to that primordial image and use it to understand your own human experience. And this requires being in touch with your authentic self rather than being identified with your ego, your persona, or a complex. Fourth, accept the transition of life cycles and seed the next generation by transmitting your wisdom. There are a few types of wisdom that a crone might have. One is practical wisdom that is amassed from life experiences, mastered skills, or accumulated knowledge. There is also spiritual insight, a sort of soul knowledge or gnosis, a divine knowing. There is ancestral wisdom, which is the generational knowing of traditions and a trusting of our instinctual nature. And there is the inner knowing of the center of the psyche, the self, the capital S self, which results in a woman being grounded in her own being, having mastered her own masculine principles such that she need not define herself in relation to a man any longer. Use this wisdom to help others on their journeys. Help bring others into a place where their external conflicts dissipate and they can experience their own essence. The crone is the queen of the underworld. If you can journey there and return in one piece, even if a little worse for the wear, you can help others when they are facing their own underworld, perhaps even being that mysterious wise woman who helps a young hero in his journey to greatness. This seeding of the next generation is one of those long, laborious tasks of the female hero, like I mentioned before. Planting seeds of wisdom in people is very slow, and you may not live to see what tree sprouts from them because of what you planted. The modern person's lack of connection to their community and to their own ancestors and descendants can lead one to think that this is not a worthwhile task because there's no selfish benefit from it. And this is in part due to the over-identification we have with our own egos, which desire for us to take the credit and the glory for ourselves and not to make sacrifices for others that would disturb our own material comfort. The reason the crone is so loved and valued and so able to do what she does is because she has transcended her own ego. She doesn't need to puff herself up by taking credit and having people know her name and talk about her. She's motivated by love and truth, which is at the core of our divine essence. And those things go beyond the trivial desires of the ego. I won't go into all the different ways in which one might achieve this state, as I do talk about it extensively in other videos. And for any men still watching, this is also true for the sage archetype. The transcending of the ego is, in my opinion, also essential for the Demeter and Aphrodite archetypes. This is not something that you should wait to start developing until you're old. And that is because in order to truly fulfill either of the roles of passive heroism, which involves serving another, you can't be letting your own ego agenda get in the way. And even for those women who don't end up following a Demeter or Aphrodite path, but who would still like to become post-menopausal women with zest who have a valued place in their extended families and communities, this still applies. In that case, you just begin working to develop your crone earlier than other women might. I wanted to make this video because I have encountered so many women who stress themselves out over being seen as useless because they don't have children, or women who feel lost once their children leave home or their husbands pass away. I feel like the view of women's role in society has become extremely narrow and myopic, and I think that this is not only harmful to women, but to everyone in society, as women are that relational linchpin that hold communities and families together. The true value of a woman is not about how beautiful she is, or how many kids she has, or how well she cooks, but how much love she can give to her community, and whether or not she builds up the people around her in a positive way. I don't believe it's good for anybody when we have large portions of the female population feeling depressed and lost, or who want to tear down traditional structures simply because they can't find their place in it, because they don't see themselves fitting in the narrow definition of what a woman's worth is. These narrow definitions don't allow women to grow into themselves and individuate, and so women understandably reach a point in their lives where they feel stuck and don't know where to turn for direction. If you are such a woman, I would like to encourage you, at whatever stage of life you might be at, to explore your crone archetype. Perhaps you were lucky enough to have a grandmother who was a good role model who could serve as a starting point in that regard, or you might turn to folklore and myths that feature crones and find a story that resonates with you and reflect on why. Whatever your path, others have traveled it before you, and they have left lanterns to light the way. We live in a disposable age. From the cheap products we buy and quickly dispose of, to the people we once loved who become forgotten, we have a crisis of culture on our hands. Traditional archetypes such as the crone represented a cherished and critical function in a hierarchical society where everyone had a role suited to his or her own nature, which worked to benefit the entire society in a meaningful way. We are, of course, a long way from such a world, but in small ways we can reclaim the perennial wisdom and make a great work of it on the canvas of our own lives. Because life is what we make it, despite the world appearing to shift beneath our feet. And when one is making an art of living, steadily gathering wisdom, becoming aware of and learning to master subtle energies, and strengthening and infusing the individual, the family, and the community with these great gifts, then what we make of life is more lasting and fruitful, and the gateways to transcendence open for us just a little bit more.